So nice to see you again.
Good morning.
Yeah. When were we speaking the last time? Just please remind me.
Well, it would have been on the 25th anniversary of the first of those two global broadcasts, which would be about June the 11th.
Yeah. It was June the 11th?
Yes.
Unbelievable. I mean, how time flies. And here you are, a very sad occasion that you're back in South Africa. But what did you feel when you heard the news?
The news of Mandela
the passing of Mandela, yeah.
Well, very, very sad moment, but of course not unexpected around the whole of the world, but a very sad moment nevertheless.
Yeah. And what brings you to South Africa now?
Well, we're making a feature documentary that looks back at those two global broadcast events of 1988 and 1990 and says what made them possible. And really what made them possible was the building of what you might call an international solidarity mountain, boulder by boulder by boulder, since about 1945, when Mrs. Pandit, Nehru's sister, put racist South Africa on the agenda of the first United Nations in 1945.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was just coincidentally that you happened to be in South Africa at the time that he passes away.
Yes, it is. We, in fact, interviewed President Zuma 2 days before, and we were very, very surprised that 2 days later, of course, Mandela would have passed.
Yeah, yeah, it's quite significant being here over this time. I can imagine. I imagine the change that this documentary is going to take.
Well, I'm not sure it will change because it's a historical documentary anyway. It stops in 1990 as Madiba takes the stage at the second event and reminds the world that his release was not the end of apartheid, but in fact he requested that the world kept the pressure up for the next 4 or 5 years till free elections.
Yeah.
That was what the second event was about, really.
All right. Let's reminisce now. Let's go back to this first event. And I know we've spoken about it before, but I want to talk about it again because it's just one of the most incredible stories that came together. Talk about the idea of doing this concert for this great man.
Well, it came out of, I mean, it wasn't as if it wasn't obvious that he should be celebrated on his 70th birthday. And there had been actions taken already by artists against apartheid in Britain, there are artists united against apartheid in America, etc. And really this event came out of discussions that I had a number of years earlier with Miriam Makeba when I promoted her in London, then with Jerry Dammers, who was running Artists Against Apartheid in Great Britain, and then with Archbishop Trevor Huddleston, who was the president of the anti-apartheid movement. And what was significant about it, really, in terms of those discussions, was that I was saying that we should be holding an event which will be a musical tribute to a man. We should narrow it down to that. Because if we do that, we can get on television around the world. We won't be breaking their regulations. They won't be being asked to be political, which they're not allowed to be. They'll be doing something musical. Well, of course, it was political as well, but that was the legal packaging of it all. Yeah.
And I mean, the guests that signed up for that, I mean, the artists were, I can imagine you were eventually pushing them away.
Well, yes, it's a strange thing. You know, for months and months, for 9 months, you've got no one.
Yeah, and then suddenly...
and then it all changes and things. And you know, people call it a snowballing effect. Well, it is a snowball effect, but nobody tells you that you're pushing it up the mountain rather than it falling down the other side.
Yeah. Remind us of who actually performed there. I mean, we saw the insert, but just talk us through it again.
Well, there were 83 in total, so I can't remember all 83.
Wow, 83 artists.
83 artists in total, but you had Stevie Wonder, Whitney Houston, Dire Straits, Eric Clapton, the Eurythmics, George Michael, Hugh Masekela, Miriam Makeba, Mahatili Queens. You also had Youssou N'Dour, Salif Keita, Jeffrey Oriema. Wow. I mean, it was a lot of artists.
Unprecedented. 83. And I mean, this was viewed around the world. I mean, as we sit here, has there been anything or any concert that's been viewed more than this by a viewership as big as this?
Well, I think you said it went to 65 countries. It went to 67 that paid, and then it went to 30 others that we gave free licenses to. Yeah. We offered any country in Africa that wanted to broadcast it a free license. So we think 30 others went. So it probably went to 90 700 countries by the time it really went out. And that was an audience of 600 million people.
Wow.
Now, at the time, there were only 5 billion in the world. So that was a very, very large percentage of the population.
Wow, that must be, I mean, that has to be a Guinness Book of Record.
Well, you have things like the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games and such things that
Yeah.
reach those sorts of audiences. So in some sense, it's not extraordinary, but it is extraordinary at the time in 1988 for a man that still people were calling a terrorist.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's exactly it. Now, we're talking 1988, where here in South Africa, I mean, having a concert and being involved in a concert, because we saw so many South Africans, artists, standing up on that stage and performing as well, and that was breaking the law. I mean, that was really putting their life on the line.
Well, Hugh and Miriam were in exile at the time, so they weren't coming back at that time, so they weren't in such a position. I was given a few weeks ago, in fact, a copy of the Rivonia trial speech printed in South Africa in 1988, with a lot of excuses around it, legal excuses of how it could even be printed. But that speech was in fact what we knew of Mandela at the first event. Most of the world knew very little. He'd been in prison for 25 years at that point in time, so we didn't know what he looked like, we didn't know what he sounded like. What we were backing was the man that had given the speech at the Rivonia trial.
Yeah, and that was all you had on him. I mean, in terms of, we talk about photographs, I mean, there were no photographs of this man.
No.
And people were just gathering, and so many people gathering for this man that almost you didn't really know much about.
No, you didn't know much about. Even if you were
knew what he
organising
stood
it, you
for.
knew a little bit. Yes, you knew what he stood by way of the Rivonia speech.
Yeah.
You knew other things. You obviously knew things that were about the ANC and their stance on things because of Oliver Tambo's work, etc.
Yeah.
You knew things about the anti-apartheid more generally around the world, but you didn't know a great deal about Nelson Mandela as a character. The way people refer to him today was impossible then.
Did you get any feedback or response from South Africa at the time?
No.
Nothing.
No.
Nothing was said about this concert.
Nothing was. No, it was. I think it was entirely banned, of course.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it was never shown here in South Africa, obviously.
No.
Yeah.
No.
It is on DVD. Is it on DVD?
No, it's not yet. It's when we produce this feature documentary that goes back to it, we'll also produce the highlights of the events as well, and all of that will come out as part of the celebration of the 20th anniversary of democracy in South Africa.
Ah, that would be an amazing thing to see. I hope we do show that across every SABC channel once it is released. When you first met him, what was that like for you?
Well, I first met him to do the second of these broadcasts, which had been requested by Madiba and the ANC to give him a platform after he was released to address the world and to ask them not to give up on the pressure, not to give up on the sanctions and the boycotts, etc., that all of that need to be kept in place. So I met him then, but it was also, I was meeting him really as a producer as he flew into London, and I was meeting him as a producer in the hurry of putting a global broadcast together to sort of talk to him about whether he was ready to go on stage, whether he'd got his speech written and such things. When I was asked to do that, I actually had one request in return, and that was that he started his speech with the word thank you.
Yes.
Now, he did that so much better than just using the word thank you. The reason I'd said it was that I didn't think he was indebted to anyone at all, but in fact it was embracing to do it, but he did it so beautifully. He actually started his speech with the words, thank you, that you chose to care. Now remember that he's addressing the international community and that this event is his official international reception. But he turns it in that way. He says, thank you that you chose to care.
Wow.
And that was a very great moment.
Oh, that must have been absolutely amazing. Talk to us about the second concert. I mean, when you had to compare the first and the second concert, it must have been a completely, obviously, a different feeling and different arrangement behind all of that.
Yes, so he'd been released, so it was a celebration. It was to be done very, very quickly. It was in fact staged 54 days after he was released. Wow. And remember that we didn't know when he was going to be released, so we couldn't do a lot of pre-planning. But it was there for a different purpose, and so we didn't need the 11 and a half hours that we had done for the first event. We needed a much shorter amount of time, but we needed enough time to be able to make sure that the broadcasters would stay with us from the beginning to the end and wouldn't think of editing.
Yes.
Because the important thing was to give him a platform to speak to the world unedited as well.
And they did.
And we did, yes. And what was surprising, what we weren't ready for, is that the audience would be so excited to see him that they gave, in fact, what was an 8-minute standing ovation.
Wow.
And which we stuck with. I mean, broadcasting, as you know, 8 minutes of standing ovation is a long thing to go for.
Yeah.
But the eulogy was so great just to see him that they had an 8-minute standing ovation and then about a 30-minute speech. But we were able to take the whole of the speech.
What was it like standing in that stage? I mean, you talk about an 8-minute standing ovation, but just what did it feel like being there for you, putting this together and watching this audience react and realizing that first was Free Mandela Concert, now there is this great man standing on the stage. 50 or so days ago he was in prison, and there he is getting an 8-minute standing ovation, and you had put this together.
Well, yes, it wasn't for me, it was for him, obviously.
But how are you feeling, though?
Yes, well, it was a wonderful thing to see. It was a very wonderful thing to see, and it was, it was a lovely sort of payoff to all of the work that had been done around the world by the International Solidarity Movement, by the anti-apartheid movements around the world in different countries, Artists Against Apartheid, all of these. It was a wonderful payoff that he was in fact released. But it wasn't the end.
Yeah.
At that point in time, he was released, but apartheid was still there in South Africa. It wasn't the end. So we weren't in such a sort of glorious position. It was with great hope that we were there, but the battle hadn't finished at that point.
Yeah, the battle hasn't finished. But I have an idea. Do you think that we could do another one of these in his memory?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it make sense to end it all off with one massive concert again in his memory?
Well, it might do. I haven't been thinking about that, but maybe others have. I'm trying to capture in this feature documentary the essence of what went in to build the mountain of solidarity that allowed those things to happen. Perhaps we should do a third, rather.
A third one,
one.
The trilogy of concerts.
Oh, gracious.
And believe me, it will be allowed to be shown here this time.
Yes, I'm sure
It'll take precedence, I can promise you that much.
Mm.
It's been amazing. I mean, it's been so lovely talking to you and just reminiscing about those days and artists that performed at the first one, the second one. Who performed at the second one, though? We actually didn't talk too much about that.
Well, some of the people that performed at the first one as well. Peter Gabriel, Tracy Chapman, Simple Minds, etc. A lot of the people that performed at the first then came back for the second. Not all of them, but it was a much shorter period of time. But they came back.
Yeah.
But I was watching some of the archive footage of around the event in the last few weeks, and I was watching Mandela and Winnie arrive in London, and for this event with Ahmed Kathrada as well in their entourage, and it is quite clear that at that point in time that that there was little of the myth around him that there perhaps is today. He was very quiet before he went on stage. He was very sort of he was a very much quieter sort of persona in a way at that point in time. It was very interesting to look back on that and think how things have changed in the last 20 years since he was released.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
That's incredible. Tony, thank you for talking to us. Thank you for popping in and coming to reminisce with us on this morning. Please remember that this broadcast is about you as well. We'd love to hear from you, and let's take a look at what some viewers are